wonderful to be in worship together as we continue our series, Tales of the Sea. In this series, we're looking at passages of Scripture in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that point to Jesus' ministry around and on the Sea of Galilee. Most of Jesus' ministry took place in this area, and some of the most significant events in the lives of the disciples and others who came into contact with Jesus happened in this place, around the sea and on the sea. And so we look back at those, but more than that, we look at the present in our own lives as those who seek to follow Jesus, and what do these stories have to say to us today? Today is the story of the feeding of the 5,000, Matthew's account of that. So important is this event that it is recorded in all four of the Gospels. And that's not very often that something is in all of the Gospels. It's certainly common that it would be in the first three in what we call the Synoptic Gospels. But to be included in all three of those and the Gospel of John is kind of unusual. And in fact, it happens twice. There's a feeding of the 5,000 here, but also in Matthew and Mark there are the accounts of the feeding of the 4,000 as well. So there was an important message here for the early church, and there is one for us today as well. We heard the story a moment ago. Jesus has gone off to an isolated place. This is after he hears about the death of John the Baptist. He goes to this isolated place, and he intends to be alone, but the crowd catches wind of where he's headed, and they rush to meet him there, crowds coming from the cities in the area. And they go to meet him there, and he has compassion on them, it says, and he ministers to them. It's late in the day then, and the disciples look around at the throngs of people, 5,000 men, not including women and children, so who knows how many thousands of people. And they're concerned. They're concerned that the crowd is getting hungry. They don't have any way of managing that, they believe. And so they say to Jesus, send the crowds away so that they can go and get something to eat. It's the only solution they could imagine. I mean, what else are they going to do? They're in an isolated place. They certainly can't do anything about it. Send the crowds away and let them take care of their physical needs. But Jesus sees another possibility. And so he says to them, there's no need to send them away. You give them something to eat. Now I can imagine that the disciples looked at one another and thought, okay, either we have missed something here, or we are following someone who's not in his right mind, or he's pulling our leg. Maybe that's it. He's joking. But they can soon see that Jesus is completely serious. You give them something to eat. Well, they say, all we have are 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus said, okay, have everyone sit down. And he distributed the 5 loaves and the 2 fish to the disciples, and they distributed it to the crowds. And when it was all said and done, and the meal was finished, everyone had eaten their fill, and there were 12 baskets full left over. Remarkable. Through the years, especially in the West, and especially in the last 400 years or so, the most important first question that people have asked approaching this story is how? It's our Western mindset. It's our scientific way of approaching things. We want to know how. How did this happen? And so through the years, commentators have said different things. Some commentators have said, well, Jesus took a little bit of food and it became a whole lot of food, enough to feed thousands of people. It's a miracle, from a little bit of food to a whole lot of food. A little bit of bread to a whole lot of bread. But other commentators said, well, that's kind of troubling, though, because in the wilderness temptation stories, didn't Jesus resist the temptation to turn stones into bread in order to gain followers? So wouldn't that wouldn't that sort of be counter to that? So maybe that's what happened. We want to know, how did this happen? Well, we don't know. Some other commentators have said, well, it was really a sacramental meal. Albert Schweitzer was one of those who wrote Quest for the Historical Jesus over 100 years ago, and he said it was a sacramental meal. Everybody got just a little bit, kind of like communion, just a little bit, symbolic bit, and they were fed spiritually by that. Well, I don't know. You can ask Ben and Diane Fisher, who prepare our communion elements every time we have communion, if 5 loaves would feed 5,000 plus women and children, even a crumb. Probably not. But it's a nice thought, isn't it? Community and people coming together in this sacramental way as we do today to the Lord's table. Lloyd C. Douglas, who was the author, a pastor and author, wrote the novel The Robe. He also wrote a story about Simon Peter, a book about Simon Peter, novel entitled The Big Fisherman. And it's in that book that Lloyd Douglas says, well, here's what I think, and this is the way he portrays it, that people going to an isolated place like that, where they would have had to walk for a very long time and they knew that they would be hungry, would have taken something to eat with them. And so everyone had some food with them, but they were hiding it because not everybody, well, I said everyone, not everybody. Some people would have joined at the last minute and, I don't know if I've got enough to share, so I'm going to hide it and I'm going to keep it to myself. But then when Jesus and the disciples begin to distribute the only little paltry amount they have, then out comes the food from the hiding places and people begin to share. And there's so much that 12 baskets full are left over. That's a nice thought too, isn't it? William Barclay says of that particular way of understanding that the change is not in bread and fish, the change is in hearts and minds. That there is this change from a selfish group of people to a selfless community of sharing. But there is that question, isn't it? We immediately want to know, how did that happen? And in some ways, that's a safe question. We can sort of be diverted from the message of it, in a way. It's that last interpretation that I find particularly troubling, because the other interpretation, the first one, Jesus does it all, and the crowd doesn't really have to do anything except receive. But that last one, everybody has to participate. And they give what they have, and then in the hands of Jesus, it's enough and more than enough. But it's not the how question that's important. In fact, that's almost never the scriptural question. The scriptural question is almost always why and what does it mean? That's the question. That's the question that persists down through the ages. It's not the how question. It's the why and what does it mean? Why did Jesus do that? Because he had compassion on the crowds. What does it mean? Not simply what did it mean, what does it mean for us now? That's the challenging and important question. Just like those disciples were on a journey to learn what it means to be a disciple and what it means to trust Jesus, and they had to learn somewhere along the way, and so important was their learning that it's in all 4 Gospels, they had to learn that what we offer to Jesus, Jesus takes and multiplies, and it's enough and more than enough. And that requires not so much understanding how, because we won't necessarily understand how. But it requires understanding that for us it means a change of heart and a change of mind to trust. It means to have a heart and mind of faith. And then it means to act on that. That's what those disciples learned, and probably had to learn over and over again. I know it's true for me. I've had to learn it over and over and over again, and I still haven't necessarily gotten it. Susan will tell you that when I respond like the disciples and say, well, this isn't possible, she will sometimes have to remind me, really? Really? Have you learned nothing in all of these years? It's a lesson disciples have to learn over and over again. In the Gospel of John, we sang about the story from that gospel, there's a little boy who offers his lunch. And Jesus takes it, and in Jesus' hands it's multiplied, and it becomes enough and more than enough. In the Gospel of John, you also have this conversation that goes on. Jesus is the one who initiates it in John, not the disciples. Jesus looks out at the throngs of people, and Jesus says, I think with a twinkle in his eye, hey, where are we going to get the money to feed all these people? Really? It's Philip who speaks and gives a perfectly rational response to that. Are you kidding? Well, he doesn't really say that, but that's the tone. He says, it would take half a year's wages to feed all these people. But it's Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, who begins to think, well, there's this kid here, and he has his lunch, 5 loaves, 2 fish. But then he quickly says, yeah, but what are they among so many? And yet Jesus takes what that child offers, and it becomes enough and more than enough, because the barrier to something important and significant happening is not the logistics. It's the mind and the heart. That's where the barrier is. You all know I'm a pilot, so every now and then you allow me to use some aviation imagery. But today I was thinking about Chuck Yeager, the great test pilot, because this year marks the 70th anniversary of the breaking of the sound barrier this October. Chuck Yeager took an aircraft beyond where an aircraft had ever gone in terms of speed. And leading up to that event, everyone was terrified. They were scared to death about what might happen. Many people were saying it's impossible to travel faster than the speed of sound. And if we try that, it will be disastrous. Chuck Yeager himself approached that with fear and trembling, and also, of course, great courage. But he wrote in his autobiography that when he got faster and faster, and when he exceeded the speed of sound, he said it was as smooth as silk. In fact, he said it was as smooth as a baby's bottom. And he said a grandmother could be sipping lemonade up front. It was a non-event. But he wrote that breaking the sound barrier, notice the language that they used, it was a barrier, was no barrier at all. The barrier was in the mind. The barrier was in the idea. The barrier was in the limited imagination. That's where the barrier was. It was in the limited understanding and knowledge. Isn't that pretty much always true? That's where the barrier is. For us as people of faith, the barrier is often our inability to have enough faith to risk. It is that barrier in our own hearts and minds that says, well, what I have is not really important. Who I am is not that important. What I can offer really doesn't matter. What can I do about it? There's not much I can do. And we face the significant challenges and problems of our world and of our community with a kind of hand-wringing anxiety. Instead of offering what we have to offer, time, money, talents, abilities, network of relationships, influence, knowledge, experience, whatever it is, offering it and then allowing Jesus to take it and to multiply it and to make it not just enough but more than enough. What we need to learn is to be people who have minds and hearts of faith and who act in faith. That is the path of discipleship that we're all on. As a pastor in a congregation, I first learned this in congregational life in my first full-time appointment out of seminary. It was in that church that we needed to build a building. And we needed to build a building that was at least 3 times the size of the building we were in. We were in a building of about, as I recall, 3,500 square feet. And we were just bursting at the seams. We didn't I mean, the whole building was that size, including sanctuary and fellowship hall and Sunday school rooms. We were growing, and we needed to build a new building. We had some property just up the highway, just down the highway. This was for the Noonday United Methodist Church, south of Tyler. We had our first building committee meeting, and we discussed that we had $6,000 in the building fund. And we needed to build at least 10,000, more like 12,000 square feet, to accommodate the needs of the church, really just in the short term, and to give us a little time to grow. It was impossible. I mean, we all sitting around the table were like Philip, rational understanding of the situation. We have $6,000. We have a membership that's growing, but it's not big enough to build a building 3 times the size that we have. What could we possibly do? And then there was someone in the group who was more like Andrew, and he said, well, I've got an idea. I'm a retired contractor. I'll act as contractor. We'll use volunteer labor on everything that we can. We'll contract the rest, and we'll build it. Well, long story short, we did that, and we built a building that was 5 times the size of the old one and served the needs of that congregation. But it took everyone in that community offering whatever it was, experience, time, talent, abilities, network of relationships to bring in people that we needed at the right time. It took everybody giving what they had and giving it in faith, and it was enough and more than enough. It's a lesson I've had to learn over and over again. I still tend to be like Philip, and I look at the stats, and I just say, well, I don't see any way. And I have to catch myself and be reminded that whatever you and I offer in faith, Jesus takes it and multiplies it, and it's enough and more than enough. And that's true as individuals, as we face the demands and challenges we face. It's true as a community of faith. It can be true as a city and as a nation as well, as we face the significant challenges that we have. We don't face it alone. It's a story that the disciples have told down through the ages. So important is it that there is a church that sits on the traditional spot where this took place, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. A church has stood there since the 4th century. The Church of the Multiplication, it's called. And there is, just in front of the communion table in that church, there is a mosaic that dates back to the Byzantine period. And the mosaic is a basket of bread and 2 fish. And in that basket there are 4, not 5, but 4 loaves of bread. On the cup and the plate down here on the communion table, you have that mosaic. These came from that church. Why 4 loaves of bread in the basket when clearly it's 5 in the gospel account? It's because the understanding is the 5th loaf is up on the table. It's the 5th loaf that we all break and share. It is a powerful way of saying in a mosaic that we all participate in that story. That we all participate in that story of Jesus taking what we offer, and it's enough and more than enough. When we come to the Lord's table, we remember that. We remember that and all of God's mighty acts in Christ. And so this morning, as we come to the Lord's table, let's come remembering that in Jesus' hands, in the hands of Christ, what we offer is enough and more than enough to do what God calls us to do and to be who God calls us to be. Amen.